Our speaker tonight is Philippa Johnstone, and I wanted to give you a little bit of background on her before we start her presentation. She has a degree in sustainable development and training in permaculture design. She started as a middle school teacher, and in that role helped design and create vegetable and pocket prairies, and has done additional work in landscaping and urban farming. She also volunteers and is on the board with the Beauties Community Garden, is a native horticulturist at Memorial Park Conservancy, and also the owner of Gulf Coast Ecological Designs, LLC. And last, she is just received her, irrigation license? Philippa, is that correct? Yeah, so she just received her irrigation license, I think it's maybe a month ago, and this is a really big accomplishment. I think it has about a 30% pass rate, and it is a day-long exam administered, I guess, for the state. So this is a really great accomplishment. We're very excited to have her here, especially for those of you who bought some plants at your native plant sale and are wondering what to do, or maybe just need a little extra advice on what to do with them. I think she is definitely a good resource, and I also work with her at Memorial Park. She is over on the same native horticulture team, and you can tell just in working with her, her passion and knowledge for native plants, and I hope you get to enjoy that too. So I'll go ahead and hand it over.
I am here to talk about my experiences as a native landscape designer, but I wanted to give a quick shout out to Native Plant Society's program called Native Landscaping. So if you are interested in learning more about any of the topics I'm about to discuss in more detail, there are some incredibly knowledgeable people at the Native Plant Society who teach this course. And there are 4 levels, I believe, as of right now. And each level helps you advance further in the process of designing and installing your own native landscape. So I highly recommend that program to all of you guys if this sparks your interest in that field of work. Okay, so I wanted to talk to you guys about where my worldview stems from, because I feel like a lot of times when we give talks, we go into a lot of detail about, like, you know, the science behind everything, which is crucially important, but I also want to talk about where I am mentally with all of this. So I was inspired by a book I read quite some time ago now called Monocultures of the Mind. And it's a book written by an incredible woman named Vandana Shiva. She is an activist who works out of India, helping farmers restore their traditional ways of growing food. And her whole, I guess, kind of breakthrough moment was really describing the errors of a monoculture mind, which is a way of thinking and seeing the world in a very small, narrow field. So we're not here to be served by nature, and I want to make that very clear. That mindset has gotten us into a lot of trouble, and the reason why we even have to have a society that is established just to appreciate native plants is because we've done so much damage to our environment and have eliminated a lot of these plants from our landscapes and from our farms and our fields and our land in general. So it's important to understand how we got to where we are today so that we can start breaking those patterns. And so I decided a long time ago to stop seeing the world the way that I was taught to see it in school. So I am not here because nature is here to serve me and it works for me and I can dominate it and it's something to control. I am here to learn more about what nature has to offer the entire world and where's my role in that process. And that's kind of where my design concepts come about is, and you'll see this pop up in my presentation, but I'm really, really a big fan of designing with nature rather than against it. So when I was a teacher, I tried to establish a pocket prairie. And when I first started out, I was still somewhat new to the native plant world. I had only learned maybe like 20 plants at the time from my permaculture class, and I was just eager to continue to learning more. And I wanted to bring it into the field of education so that my middle school students could also be exposed to what Houston used to look like before it became a heavily industrialized city. So I actually showed up at Mark Morgenstern's house, and he showed me his entire property, took me to Nash Prairie, and I met Susan Conity there, and I met a bunch of other people. And I wanted to really give a shout out to Mark because he was one of the most influential people in my early days of native plants. He is probably one of the most generous people I've met. Not only is he knowledgeable in the native plant world, but he's willing to share anything he knows and has learned from himself. And so he did a talk recently. If you got to see it, awesome. If you haven't gotten a chance to shop at his plant store or meet him, definitely try to, because he is an incredible person. And I'm forever grateful for the experiences that I was able to have, which have sparked so much more interest in native plants since those early days. And these photos were taken my first time at Nash Prairie. So that's kind of what started this whole storm, you could say. So I guess, you know, native landscaping to me is about rebuilding an ecosystem. So especially in Houston, where we have a lot of environmental problems like flooding, sometimes we have droughts, we do have tropical storms and hurricanes, and climate change is definitely already making itself known to us in various ways. So the first reason to build a native landscape and to rebuild a native prairie is to combat the negative effects of climate change and build climate change resiliency. So if we have stronger plants with stronger root systems, and I don't know if you guys have seen this poster on the bottom left screen, but this is a kind of to scale drawing of the comparison of native plant root systems to a typical turf grass, which is this last little guy on the left. Those root systems are going to hold way more water than Bermuda grass or St. Augustine. So we're already one step ahead of ourselves when we plant native plants in an area that needs to have flood control, which is most of our city. So one main reason to do native landscaping. Another one is to combat environmental racism, which has been historically a huge problem in our city, where industrial sites that are creating a lot of pollution are strategically located in minority neighborhoods. And there's a growing movement to start changing the way that urban planning is structured so that we stop, you know, placing things in unfair sites in our city, and to start questioning what we should do with vacant lots and what we should do with empty land, rather than just let it fall in the hands of a company. We're talking about maybe building more parks, more community gardens, more prairies, more water retention systems, and healthier stormwater management basins in our city. And I'll just go through the rest kind of quickly. Those are like my top two that I'm really passionate about. So native plants can help reduce soil erosion, and they can help increase the quality of your soil. We'll talk about that in a little bit. It's a great ecological pest management system. If you are growing vegetables and you have a lot of issues with pests, native plants can help you deal with those. We talked about flood mitigation, also education. As a former teacher, and I still kind of do a little bit of teaching on the side, I find it very important to incorporate the things that we're talking about today into the young minds, the people that are going to be taking care of this earth in the future. It also helps restore your emotional well-being. That's something that we all can personally share about. So I won't go further because I'm sure you've all experienced, or I hope you've all experienced, the restorative power of being in nature. And then of course, rewilding, which is something that I've just recently started to learn about, which is reintroducing wildlife and kind of letting them decide how they live in a newly restored area, rather than us trying to force an ecosystem on top of something that's not supposed to be there. So we are going to dive right in to The whole philosophy of Gulf Coast Eco Designs is design with the land rather than against it. So the main slides I'm going to talk about are going to be observation, respect, create, and care. The section labeled as create is going to be where I'm going to focus the most because that's where all the designing happens. But observe and respect are the steps I take before I start the design process, which are going to be crucially important. And of course, the last one is going to be more about maintenance and care, which won't be as big of a focus, but again, take the Native Landscape course at Native Plant Society and you will learn more about all of these concepts in further detail. Okay, so whether you are designing a landscape in your backyard, whether you are designing at a church garden bed, whether you're designing for a restaurant garden or a school pollinator bed, these steps are all going to be the same. This also goes true for anybody who lives anywhere in Texas. You know, this is not, I'm in Houston, so I'm going to focus on things that are relevant to that city, but a lot of these processes and steps will be relevant to pretty much all of Texas and probably anyone who's interested in landscaping and native landscaping. Okay, so I have to move my little bar over here. I'm having a moment. Okay, my moment is over. Got myself situated. Now I can see my actual screen. Okay, so observing the land is really important because you do need to get to know the space in terms of what is the actual ecosystem that you are standing on. What I've used in the past is this ecoregion map of Texas, which kind of breaks Texas up into these main sections where you'll find, for example, the Gulf Coast Prairie and Marshes, Edwards Plateau, Post Oak Savanna, all of those ecosystems that are native to Texas are kind of neatly scoped out for you on this map. So find yourself and know where you are. And if you're in between, I envy you because that's kind of cool. You get to have like a little bit of everything. But if you're in Houston, we are on top of a Gulf Coast prairie. And based on that information, you can actually research on this wonderful, wonderful website, BONAP, in terms of how, which plants are actually native to your specific region. So I'm guilty of pulling plants that are native to, you know, maybe northern Texas and planting them in Houston, and I still do that. I'm guilty. But if you really want to keep it as ecologically appropriate, I guess you could say, as possible, you can go to BONAP and they will tell you down to the nearest county what plants are native to your region. I highly recommend that because it's important to know which plants will thrive and which plants are supposed to be here. Understanding the condition of your soil is also very important. Everyone complains about our gumbo, you know, clay soil, but native plants love that soil. So you're in luck if you're doing native gardening. The only thing I want to talk about though is that a lot of times construction and industrial activities can remove a lot of our topsoil and scrape a lot of the organic material that were existent in the soil, as well as fungal networks and microbes that are all very important to a plant's health. So part of what you want to make sure you're doing is assessing the quality of your soil. You can send them in for testing at A&M, or you can just do an assessment on your own if you feel confident. You know, I like to just dig into the soil about 6 inches, and I like to look at the different levels or layers, if there are any. And you can tell if it's really sandy, if there was like builder's fill that was added to it, if it's more compact, more clay, if it's hydrophobic, like it's hard for you to water the soil. All of those things are going to be really important for you to determine whether or not your landscape needs to be amended or anything needs to be added or removed. I'm going to switch on the light. Oh, wait. Here we go. Okay. And it's also important to, this is what I do with my students, is we feel the soil between our fingers, we smell it, and we do the pinky test. So sticking your pinky in this ground and just seeing how moist it is. All of those things are valid. You know, if you're doing a major restoration project, yeah, you might want to send those samples into the lab, but if you're just doing your own backyard, these methods will work. And then one of the most important things is also how much sunlight is you're getting on the land. So there's various light conditions. Full sun is considered 6 to 8 hours of sunlight. Part shade is considered 4 to 6. And then dappled sun could be either part shade or full sun, but the sunlight that you're getting is usually through a canopy of trees. And there are plants that thrive in dappled sun, and there are plants that would not thrive in dappled sun. So it's important to know what your lighting conditions are. An app that I use for that is called Sun Tracker. I forgot to add it to this presentation, but I just remembered. Next, we're going to talk about respect. And my slides are not changing, so I apologize. Here we go. Okay. Getting to know the surrounding, okay, there we go. Getting to know the surrounding community of plants, people, and animals. You don't want to destroy something that's already working, especially if it's providing essential habitat for wildlife. Okay, so maybe I'm not a huge fan of certain sedges and grasses. I personally think they have their role in this world, and I've started to use them in my designs, but there are occasions where I run into them that are just growing in the wild, and I'm like, as a designer, I'm like, oh, how would I even incorporate that into a design? But what I've started to do is recognize that it's not just about what looks pretty and what's cute to me, it's about who benefits from that plant. So a green tree frog could be living or using those reeds that I might not find as beneficial for a design. So remember that having that respect for what's already working and what's already existent is really important, even as a designer. And then it's important to know whether or not you would be enhancing or disturbing the environment based on your plan. You know, if you want to bring in new soil, what's your process behind that? Are you going to run a tiller through the existing soil? If so, have you considered that there are other methods besides tilling to inoculate your soil and amend it? You know, are there nearby sources of water such as ditches, swales, ponds, bayous, lakes, and creeks? If you're going to use an herbicide, which I'm typically against, but I know that some people, there's no other alternative, you know, making sure that that herbicide doesn't run into any crucial waterways. You know, are there any surrounding wildlife corridors? You know, if you live near a power line easement, you probably get coyotes, you probably get foxes. You know, be mindful of the fact that wildlife is you know, our wildlife is looking for places to live and eat and drink water, and you have to be willing to share your space, you know, to some extent. That's just my philosophy. A little short story about this whole topic of respect. I was recently doing some maintenance in a client's backyard, and I discovered that a southern carpenter bee was making its home in an elderberry trunk. And I was actually going through and kind of cutting back a lot of the elderberry because it grows like a weed, even though it's native. A lot of people will kind of limit how much is growing there because it will take over if you let it. And so I was just kind of minding my own business. And then I saw this tiny little hole and I actually realized it was a carpenter bee. And I decided to leave it, you know, even though I had plans for that space and I wanted to remove it, I decided to leave it until the bee is done. And then we'll go back and we'll revisit and we'll put another plant in there. Or maybe we'll leave that plant. Maybe we'll let a few of the elderberries stay so that the bees, our solitary native bees, can use it as a home. This is a little possum I rescued under a house because it was going to be, they were going to be killed anyway. So I thought, let me save them. And you can have the option of bringing wildlife to our wildlife center in Texas. They're a really great group, and they often rehabilitate the animals and reintroduce them to the wild if possible. So that's what they did with these possums. So yeah, being mindful of your fellow neighboring creatures. Okay, so we understand where we are. . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . . Now we're choosing our plants for the space. So this is something that I've tried to incorporate more and more into my practices, is making sure to choose native plants and avoid the cultivars. So if anyone who knows me personally, you know that I really don't like using botanical names or Latin names of plants in conversation, because I want native landscaping and native plants to be something that's more welcoming and accessible to everyone. And I find that when I use Latin names, it scares people because the words are just so hard to pronounce. And especially if you're a teacher for younger kids, they might not grasp those concepts. So you do want to use common names when you're in conversation. Like, it's also really cool because if I tell a kid this plant is called rattlesnake master, they're going to ask me questions about why is it called that, and they're more engaged. Whereas if you say Eryngium yuccifolium, they're just going to be like, what? So make sure, you know, let's sell native plants as an accessible world. Okay. That being said, it's important to know the botanical names, because when you go to buy them from the nursery or, you know, get the seed, you need to make sure you're getting the true native. A lot of times you'll see the native name and then a word in parentheses next to it, and that usually means it's a cultivar. For example, Salvia coccinea hot lips is a cultivar of the native salvia. And unfortunately, when growers hybridize plants and create cultivars, sometimes the plant is designed so that the petals are much larger than the actual pollen and nectar source. So if a bee lands on that flower thinking it's one thing, they might actually have to work twice as hard just to get that little bit of pollen, because the flower is structured differently. So it is actually very important to know the botanical names when you are buying from the nursery. Make sure that you are selecting plants that are appropriate for your soil and your microclimate. You know, we talked about observing your area. We might be on a Gulf Coast prairie, but your specific little piece of land that you're working on might not be suitable for every type of plant on a Gulf Coast prairie. You know, you might have a little bit more shade. Your soil might be in a worse condition than a prairie soil. So think about what plants can thrive in your location. And the reason why I added this picture is because I did a small, like a rain garden for a client, and some native sedges just started popping up. And initially, you know, my mind is like, okay, they're weeds. But then I realized, no, this is what grows here. They like it. So let them be, you know. Obviously don't let it get out of hand, but it's always wonderful when native plants decide where they want to go, because they will move and they will spread their seeds elsewhere, and you'll learn that. It's also important to increase the biodiversity and therefore the resiliency of your land by choosing a variety of species. You can't just do flowers. I'm sorry. You can't just do flowers. You've got to do grasses. You got to do sedges. You've got to do shrubs. You have to have a mix of everything, because that's what's going to feed the wildlife, and that's what's going to have a perpetual palette of color on your landscape. Not only should we make sure that we're growing native plants, but that they're sourced locally. So I'm not ordering my plants from a nursery all the way in Kentucky. I'm either collecting from a site where I have permission to collect seeds or plants from, or I am buying from a local nursery such as Green Star Wetland Nursery or Morningstar Prairie Plants. This is a picture of Eryngium hookeri, which is Hooker's eringo. It's a wildflower that is native to our coastal prairie, and it was growing in between a barbed wire fence and a regular fence at a car dealership that was being built. And my boyfriend just randomly saw them, and he was like, hey, isn't this a native plant? And I was like, go collect them now, let's go. So we actually got permission from the manager, the contractor, and he allowed us to go out there. And naturally I put him to work and I made him cut the seed heads with me. So you can't get more local than that. That was off of like Highway 59 going south. This is a slim milkweed plant I collected off of Highway 288 with permission, of course. So the reason why you want to get locally sourced native plants is because they have been growing in our current changing climate. Those plants are used to our crazy floods, our, you know, droughts, all the things that we get in Houston, all those weather patterns. Those plants are adapting in real time to those changing conditions, especially upon climate change we need to be growing more things locally and letting them adapt and evolve over time. So now that we have all of our plants, all of our ideas and understanding of the land, I want to talk about when we're creating and designing a space, how you can turn problems into solutions. Okay, so there's a lot of homes and gardens and sites in Houston that have really bad erosion problems. This is because a lot of time houses are designed to rush water off the property and into the street. And so you have these like down slopes that just receive a gush of water every time it rains, and all of that essential like top layer of organic material gets washed out. So this was a site I did. I conducted a survey on how the land was structured and how this soil was having very few results. The client was trying to plant all kinds of things and they got not much out of it. You can even see over here in the corner, they couldn't even get turf grass to grow there. So I converted it into a small wetland. So this area stays constantly wet. And because of that, I knew I could grow plants that thrive with wet feet. So we have our native blue flag iris, our horsetail rush, and Maximilian coneflower, as well as, I think that was it, sorry. I'm like trying to remember. So you can enrich soil by growing the right plants, right? So those native plants are going to now establish their root systems and pull nutrients from down below, hold on to water, and also keep that soil from getting washed out. I also applied some organic treatment to the soil to feed the soil microbes. I did not apply fertilizer to the soil. I don't really use fertilizer, and I'll go into that later, but I prefer to restore the health of the soil because the native plants know what to do. They have their ways of finding the nutrients and growing and doing what they do best. Our job is to give them back that environment where they can do that. If you do have a space that doesn't have constant saturation, you know, irrigation, I'm not against it. I do want to do things that are more water conscious, but if irrigation is ever needed on your site or in your land, consider sustainable practices like using rainwater harvesting, or there are reclaimed or gray water systems that you can have on your property as well that use recycled water. So this was another site I did where the problem was they lived in a floodplain and they had constant issues back here with invasive plants such as the elephant ear, and the turf was actually not really growing very well in this section. And so that to me meant that the habitat was unfavorable for most ornamental plants. And being the person that I am, we can solve that problem with some native plants. So we turned it into a marsh. This area is not constantly wet, but it's frequently flooded. And so I selected plants that can grow in soil with bad drainage, meaning this soil can be constantly wet for a long period of time or dry for a long period of time. And so I selected salt marsh mallow, muck sunflower, Turk's cap, and buttonbush. They can withstand brief periods of drought, but they love getting like inundated with floodwaters and staying wet. And so since then, we've not had as many issues with her property. It was a semi-recent installation, so I'll have to continue to monitor and see what else happens. All right, so this is kind of the artsy, designy stuff that I love. We'll mix it in with ecology, but I wanted to talk about how important it is to create points of interest. A lot of time, a native landscape can look a little unkempt and wild, and some people like that look and some people don't. And we have to understand that, you know, if you're doing this for a publicly visited area like a school garden or a restaurant or whatever public space, you might have to have more of a refined look with your native plants. And so to do that, I like to highlight plants that are unique, larger in size, or attract certain wildlife. I really wanted to get my hands on the endangered rose mallow hibiscus that's not really easily distributed, but at the time I was able to get Texas star hibiscus, which is unfortunately not native to Houston, but it is native to Texas. So again, it goes back to like where you draw the line with native plants, how native I do still incorporate plants that are native to Texas in general, because if they do well, I want to see how they can thrive, especially in a changing environment with climate change happening. So I do incorporate things like prickly pear cactus and Texas star hibiscus and other plants that are not necessarily endemic to Houston. But anyway, picking plants to highlight and feature can really help the viewer or the person visiting the garden to focus their attention on certain parts of the landscape that you want them to. I also use dramatic curves. So this was a project I did at St. Julian's Crossing, which is a wildflower pollinator garden and small nonprofit. I incorporated a small little swirl because we put in blue mistflower, which can get a little, for lack of a better word, it can get a little crazy and jungly. So I thought, okay, it's going to take over the space no matter what, but if we put this swirl here, we can maintain it and clip it back so that it stays in its little lane and people can look at it and appreciate it for what it is instead of just being like, what's that crazy bush over there? So keep in mind that people might have a negative view of native plants until you put them on a little pedestal and show off, this is what they do. Same thing with like indigo. I like to plant that on its own. It just does so well when it has the opportunity to spread like that, and people need to see how beautiful this plant is. And again, you know, you can add your own style. Please don't use garden gnomes. And if you do, I don't want to have anything to do with it because I think they're silly. I like the plants to speak for themselves, but obviously do it what you love, right? So like you can actually put in accent pieces of your own. I use moss stones that I get. That's a really big one that we use to kind of feature that section. You can also use logs that you find. Those are beautiful accents to a landscape bed, and they're actually, they serve as basking sites for reptiles, just like stones. They can also become a habitat for snakes or frogs. And then of course, everyone's favorite, a bird bath. You can't go wrong with it. I just suggest putting in like a little solar pump fountain that keeps the water running so that you're not attracting mosquitoes. And we did one over here. That's a bird bath. Okay, so with the feature plants, these are just some that I've used in the past. Hercules club, parsley, hawthorn, and Mexican plum are my top favorite trees to grow in Houston. For grasses, I like to feature Gulf Coast muley, eastern gamma, split-beard bluestem. And then for forbs, which are flowers, coneflower, Texas coneflower, indigo, which was in this previous slide, and then my slides froze again. I need to stop doing that. Okay, oops. Salt marshmallow. And this was another example of how you can kind of make your landscape your own. Like this client put in her own lighting, and I feel like that kind of featured the plants on their own as well. Gulf Coast muley really captures that light. So this is salt marshmallow. I got this from Morningstar Prairie Plants. It grows pretty big and it does not behave. So I kind of keep it in its own little space and let it do its thing. You can prune it to keep it, give it nice shape. This is Gulf Coast muley. I actually have started growing these as a specimen plant, so I like to feature them as opposed to growing them as a hedge. They catch water really nicely in the rain, and they just have these beautiful visual components throughout the whole year. You know, this is like summertime prime, this is like fall. So they just have beautiful transitional colors, and then their flower head is just gorgeous, or their seed head, I'm sorry. Okay. So creating a sustainable place means that you're not just designing a landscape that's going to be a nightmare to take care of, because you will have to take care of it. So I talk about, you know, avoid relying on chemical fertilizers to rebuild soil health. Try to use organic products that actually restore the microbial soil food web rather than just pumping your plants with fertilizer. One example of what I use is humic acid. It's an amazing product. I've also, in the past, have worked with compost tea, which is getting more and more fame these days because of how great the results are. Never, ever let your soil go bare. So based on that principle, I like to maintain the soil moisture by implementing ground covers. Frog fruit is probably my top ground cover. I've used it as a weed barrier. I've used it as a mulch. I've used it as a ground cover. So it has these beautiful white flowers, and it attracts a variety of insects, including bees and butterflies. and it'll help reduce your need to go through and pull weeds. I actually eradicated a nutsedge problem at a client by just letting a carpet of frog fruit just grow over the nutsedge and shade it out completely. It did still require me to pull and weed, but it's now established, and so I don't have to do as much weeding. This is an example of a grass lawn that I converted into frog fruit. This was the before and this was the after. I actually drove by this site the other day and asked if I could take some pictures, and there were so many bees. I mean, this was just covered in bees. And if you go into a typical American lawn and you take a net and try and catch some bugs, you won't find much. But if you go out into a native landscape or a prairie, I mean, there's so much life. It's just incredible. So my next step in the create kind of field, and I'll start wrapping up soon because I know we're running out of time, is create biodiversity. So incorporate plants that have varying heights, colors, and textures, because that's what's going to give you a year-round habitat. So if I grow rattlesnake master for that spiky, like kind of wow factor, and then I combine it with twist leaf goldenrod, which is kind of this light feathery yellow, and then I add in a large shrub with smoother pointy leaves, such as the Barbados cherry, I'm providing a habitat for, I would say, close to 1,000 insects. I don't know if all 1,000 would show up, but doing the research on these plants, they are incredible habitat plants, especially rattlesnake master. So I like to incorporate these things not only because they provide habitat, but also because you're going to get year-round color. You know, when this is not flowering, this will turn into this brown kind of bronze color, and you'll have these like spikes kind of dotting the landscape. And then this is what flowers in the fall, and that's what the bees are eating. And then you get this beautiful carpet of yellow to look at. Barbados cherry is fruiting right now. The non-dwarf, this is just a mature Barbados cherry, not the dwarf variety. And the cherries are about this big, and they're absolutely delicious. The birds eat them, humans can eat them. So you're getting something from each plant. You know, you're getting something to eat, you're watching the bees, and then you have this beautiful visual flower to look at. All right, so mimicking what already works in nature, I like to create spaces that are very dense with plants because that's what our native prairies look like. If you ever go out to Nash Prairie or Deer Park Prairie, it's very difficult to walk. You know, the plants don't mind being trampled on because they're used to having like ancient bison just trumble through and, you know, nibble on things, and they're used to being set on fire, for example. So you can't ruin a prairie by walking on it. Likewise with a native garden, don't worry about that. Make it as dense as you can. But with that being said, make sure that you do factor in the mature sizes of all those native plants. When you get a plant, it might be a cute little adorable baby, but then in a few months, it might be a monster that you have to go back and kind of trim. So make sure that you're incorporating the mature sizes. And I also group my plants according to height. So I allow my shorter creeping plants to be in the front. This is where I put all my milkweeds and the frog fruit and the wine cup. And then I allow like sort of a shelf to establish. So then I would do some wildflowers like firewheel, Gladiacella. I'm sorry, wrong name. I'll get the name for you later. Firewheel, and then I start doing the taller ones like my shrubs like the salt marshmallow. And then for taller wildflowers like American basket flower, Texas coneflower, and laetris, they're like these spikes in a prairie, as you can see in this photo. They don't really like to be told what to do, so don't really plant them in clumps because they won't stay that way. Especially with Salvia coccinea or cardinal sage, I like to sprinkle them because they're going to do that anyway by spraying their seeds everywhere. So you might as well just set them up and say, okay. And they also look beautiful when they're poking out. Like you get these little pops of yellow, pops of purple throughout the space. So now I'm tired of hearing myself talk. I'm going to switch over to a short video, which is just going to pan over a landscape that I did back in February and how it looks now, just to give you an idea of how all these plants have grown to their full size. I'll be narrating. My voice is really annoying in this video, so I'm just going to mute it. And I'm not really talking about anything important. So I'm just going to Okay, so you can see in the back, there's the Barbados cherry. This was firewheel. I planted maybe 3, and that's how large they got. So just keep that in mind. In the back, you can see the shrubs. And then I attempted to make wine cup become a ground cover, but I wasn't there to maintain it enough. So it got crowded out. So that's another thing, is just letting plants have their own space. That was rosinweed sunflower, the yellow one. Salt marshmallow, which, by the way, you can actually use the roots and make marshmallows with them. The name is not inaccurate. And then letting those taller flowers kind of poke up through the middle. This is blue mist flower, makes a great little shrub. And then I think that's as far as I go. It started like raining and lightning. So again, be careful with picking some of these wildflowers, because they have a tendency to behave as a perennial, even though they're an annual. This is my latris and coneflower. I kind of sprinkled them throughout, but you can tell they're already like shooting up. You know, they're like ready to make themselves known. And then I put a strawberry bush. There's an olive tree in there. I'm sorry, I love olive trees. I can't help it. The client wanted them, so anyway. Okay. There are plenty of native trees to use, and I went over a few of those earlier. So, okay. Using borders can help, as well as using signs. They can help your landscape look a little more refined, like we talked about earlier. So it's kind of like, you know, you put all the wildness behind a nice, like, kind of swooping border, just to keep it manageable and draw people's attention. I always use curved lines. I never use geometric shapes. There's very few things that exist in nature that are geometric. So why force something that doesn't really look good? My next slide is about, let's see, borders again. So this is some work that I did at St. Julian's Crossing. Again, a really great garden if you ever get a chance to go see it. Lauren is an incredibly talented woman, and she designed this landscape herself. I cannot take the credit for this beauty right here. But what we did do is I helped her with incorporating a border, just to kind of feature her plants a little bit more and give it some more depth and highlights. So I used some stones and gravel and then black metal edging, just to kind of show the beds and give them their own little space. You can also do dry riverbeds. I use beach pebbles, they're gorgeous. Weeding them can be a bit of a nightmare. I use a flame weeder, which allows me to not use herbicides. So it's just like a little torch that you use, and it burns the weeds that are really small. And this was that video that I showed y'all is this landscape. So you can see how small the plants were when I planted them, and then how they just, crazy town, right? Okay, highlighting trees and larger shrubs. I like to do like tree lines. So these are all native trees: Mexican plum, loblolly pine, and I did some oak trees in there as well. And what I did was give them some rock borders, just to give them a little bit of oomph and like, hey, this is a tree, check it out. It just looks a little more intentional and a little less chaotic. Using signs can help with the client. If you're doing this for somebody else, if you're doing this for a school or a public area, it's important to teach people what's growing and why it's important. So you can get those wildlife certified garden signs, or just regular metal signs that tell what the plant is. Highly suggest using signs. We're getting to the end now. Seasonal transitions are really important. So understanding what your plants will look like throughout the entire year, and letting it change over time and evolve. So milkweed is one of my favorite examples, because they have such dramatic transitions. You know, after they're done flowering, you know, they create these gorgeous seed pods. Try to collect those seeds. It's a great way to teach kids about how seeds can be distributed by wind, because they get distributed in these little like puff balls, and the pod almost like explodes and then distributes the seeds. So you can learn a lot from those transitions in your garden. I also like to talk about how things become bronze and brown and darker, during fall, and we'll talk about that at the end as well. And so I just want to make sure you guys keep that in mind when you are planning your landscape. Incorporating the variety of perennials that we talked about, wildflowers, vines are incredibly important because you can grow them along a fence line and really beautify a fence. So I'm doing coral honeysuckle along this fence line. It hasn't established yet, but this is a picture of it flowering. And having shrubs and perennials that will remain active throughout the seasons will help give your pollinators and your insects habitat to build and to live in. And I put Salvia coccinea here because I feel like this plant is always flowering. I really don't know a single month out of the year where I haven't seen it flower. So it's really a beautiful plant to have to just fill in the spaces. But be careful, it will spread like wildfire. And then of course, by doing this, you're providing a diverse color palette and food and habitat sources year round. So when I cut back a certain plant, I always make sure that I have a plant growing in front of it that will then take over that space. So my best example is sweet scent Placenta odorata. And then in front of it, I have Gulf Coast Muley because they flower at different times and they have an interesting kind of look during their time of year, during their prime time. When my blazing star latris is dormant, the prairie sage will fill that space with a silvery hue because it stays this color year round. And then of course, when you care for the landscape, make sure that you don't leave the soil bare. We talked about this earlier. You might have to consider filling your space in with more plants if some plants didn't work. You know, when you're cutting back your grasses, make sure to leave those cuttings on the ground. They'll keep your soil moist. And they also provide trimmings for birds to build their nests with and frogs to hibernate under. Leave behind, this picture's not excellent in showing you, but this is a coneflower stem that I left behind. Our solitary bees like to burrow inside those stems. So it's very important to leave behind those brown sticks that are pithy and kind of like dry. Leave those behind because that's what the insects use during the winter. Everything in wildlife in the wilderness gets used. There's no trash can, there's no waste hauling service in a forest or a prairie. Animals, plants, everything gets used. So make sure you let that happen in your space as much as you can. And then of course you have this added benefit of ecological pest management. So you don't really, when you're maintaining your landscape, you don't really have to worry too much about pests. And there is something unsettling about a plant that's pristine and untouched because plants are supposed to be eaten. They're supposed to be ripped apart. They're supposed to be gnawed on. They're supposed to be trampled on. You know, those milkweeds that we grow, they get stripped bare every year and then they always come back. You know, the caterpillars are supposed to chew on the leaves. So whenever you do have a pest problem though, and let's say it is an issue, you have to look at the whole system. So there was some scale on a muck sunflower and I was like, okay, I'm gonna wash off the leaves and try and, you know, solve this problem organically. But then I found an assassin bug who had some attitude with me when I was trying to take a picture of him. So I realized he was like working, you know, he's like taking care of the problem for me. So I find this a lot in the landscapes that I do. There are these predatory native insects that are often patrolling almost like a task force, and they're taking care of your garden pests. And this happens in a vegetable garden too. And make sure to refrain from using even organic pesticides. Like BT will actually kill monarch caterpillars because it kills all caterpillars. So it's not a selective pesticide. It will kill all of the grubs and caterpillars. So I like to be careful when I'm doing my pest management, if any at all. And this is my last slide. The transition period is really important. So in the fall and the winter, take a break from weeding. And winter is dormancy for plants and dormancy for you. You know, we are supposed to be reflecting during this time and slowing down. And that's what trees are doing. They're pulling all their sugars, all their nutrients back down, and they're reassessing for the next year. And that's what plants are doing. So I recently went to Enchanted Rock and I just thought, how beautiful is this, like this palette of just death, really. I mean, it's grays, browns. It's just a very beautiful time. Everything is still and quiet. And it's a time for you to look for, you know, nesting sites for birds, come up with your plan for the next summer, collect your seeds, and try something new. I added this little poppy here because this is a native Scottish red poppy. And it has a lot of sentimental value to me. And because of that, I grow it every year in a little container. And I want you guys to know that these landscapes are supposed to bring you joy. And so, you know, we talk about native plants and we talk about BONAP and making sure you know your region. And I am a huge advocate for that. But there's nothing wrong with growing what you love. You know, if you want to incorporate 1 or 2 plants like a rosemary bush or something like that, you know, as long as it's not an invasive plant, it's okay. There's no police that are going to come to your house and tell you that you're wrong for growing a beautiful plant, as long as it's not doing any harm. So I just want to make that clear. I'm not a militant native plant person. I love them and I think they're beautiful and they have their place, but it's important to make sure that you are doing this to give yourself joy as well. And so that is the end of my talk. I'll take questions if there's time. Again, so I wasn't really doing this talk to like promote my business, but this is my business. So if you are interested in learning more about what I'm doing, please, 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 please never hesitate to send me an email. Also, if you can, please follow me on Instagram. That's kind of where all my stuff is happening right now. I do a lot of educational videos and posts, and I'm working on building a website, but until then, my Instagram is kind of where it's all at. And so that is me. I'm gonna unmute or I guess not unmute, but open up the floor to the other admin team because I'm not sure how the questions work, but if there are questions, I guess I can take them.
Hey, Philippa, it's Alyssa. We got some questions in our chat. The first one is, do wetland plants prefer more sun than shade?
It really depends. And this would be a question for, I realize I'm just sitting in the dark here. I'm so sorry. I'm like a ghoul. This would be a good question for Mary Carol Edwards of Green Star, but what I've, with my experience, a lot of wetland plants are full sun because there's not a lot of trees in the wetlands, and so there's not a lot of shade.
Awesome. The next question is, where do you get the plant signs that you had in your presentation? The little like that you can add the name to.
Oh yeah, those are great. So if you go to A.M. Leonard, they're a horticultural supply company and they'll sell you the metal sign, and then get yourself a grease pencil because you'll write with that on the sign, and then it's water resistant so it won't smudge. So grease pencil and metal sign, A.M. Leonard.
It's good to know. I definitely would have attempted with some kind of with a different pencil.
Yeah, Sharpies don't.
Yeah. Oh yeah. A.M. Leonard's the place to go. The next question is, what species of indigo is in your photos?
Let me, it's Baptisia. It was the one that I believe the common name is wild indigo. Wow, this is Sphaerocopa.
I think Sphaerocopa. Okay.
Thanks, Chelsea. I got a SOS text. I like I said, I'm bad with Latin names. I knew it was native, but I was just like, I forgot the Latin name for it. But yeah, Sphaerocopa. Carpa, sorry.
Okay, great. Okay, a few more questions. So you mentioned that you use a program to track like the amount of sun a location has. Is that Sun Track or Sun Track?
Sun Track. Or Sun, yeah.
Okay, Sun Track.
Yeah, if you Google it. And then also Google Earth has a feature now that you can look at a place like, and you can like slide a bar and it'll show you like the hour of the day where the sun is.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there's some cool free online stuff now. So.
Even better. Okay. All right. So, and if you can just confirm the scientific name for muck sunflower, I think Mark had it in there. Let me see if I can find it. It's swamp sunflower.
I bought those from, it's Helianthus simulans.
Okay. All right. And that's what Mark had mentioned too. So thank you, Mark, as well. Okay. What is so we need the Latin name of Barbados cherry. Do you know that one off the top of your head?
It's not the dwarf, just so you know, so it'll be a little different, but so the one that I have is Malpighia emarginata.
Emarginata. Okay. Thank you.
I believe,
let me see. Sounds like it. Yeah, that sounds like the right one. Okay, I'm just watching a few more notes come in, making sure I didn't miss any questions. Is when you have like a weed problem and you need a ground cover, is frog fruit your go-to, or have you tried any others?
frog fruit all the way. If I could be like a fan of frog fruit, like a little, I don't know, like paint my face, I don't know. I love frog fruit so much. I've used it in so many places. Another one you could do is creeping spot flower. And another one is, we talked about, oh, wine cup, sorry. Lauren, if you ever go to St. Julian's Crossing, Lauren Simpson she's established a wine cup ground cover and it looks beautiful.
Awesome.
So yeah, those are the other two.
Okay, so a few more questions. So what, okay, so you mentioned the impact of flower cultivars. What about, I think the cultivar for switchgrass, Dallas Blues, can you share your opinion on that one?
I don't know about that one. I really am still familiarizing myself with what's available these days in the nurseries commercially versus locally. I would just say, try your best to research based on, like I use the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and I use their website because it'll tell me what benefit that plant brings to like pollinators and wildlife. And so like if it's something like a pollinator source or a food source, you want to be as careful as possible about not choosing a cultivar. Whereas maybe for something that's more ornamental, I don't know, that's just me, but I don't want to sway you in the wrong direction. But I don't want to say something that I don't know, so.
Okay. And definitely, I can understand like your point of view too, like if it has like a ecosystem service that involves another insect or animal, to consider if that benefit is lost in that cultivar. And if it is something that is truly ornamental with maybe different ecosystem services, then maybe that's the good gray area.
And then one more thing is that I forgot to mention this, but sometimes cultivars will flower at a different time. So one of the biggest ones is like the issue with tropical milkweed and how it stays blooming for much longer than it should. And so a lot of monarch caterpillars catch a virus that they shouldn't catch because they're on the leaves too long and they're sharing the same leaves and they're spreading it. So it's important to know the bloom time and if it's appropriate for that specific migratory insect or bird or whatever that's coming through that space and using it. If it's not blooming at the right time, that could be another issue. So I don't know how that applies to that switchgrass in particular, but I'm sure there'd be, more research needed for that.
Okay. All right, next question. Have you used horse turf as a ground cover or in any other application?
I'm not gonna lie. As a designer, I don't like horse herb. If I were to fill a space with a ground cover that was never irrigated, really poor soil, I would use horse herb. That's, I've maintained it at a site and it did really well as a ground cover, and I think it did its job. But I don't like how it looks. I'll just be frank.
That's fair. I'm a fan of some frog fruit too. I have some in my backyard. And I think I agree too that there's an application for each of these plants, and you've listed a lot of great resources in addition to the information you've shared on how to help pick which one's going to be best. Okay, next question. So we had straggler daisy was also another recommendation. I think the question came up was what maintenance is there involved in frog fruit? And I would like to expand on that question and ask what are the common maintenance items that you do on your landscapes throughout the year?
Okay, so a lot of the time I just show up and I stare at the plants for like 15 minutes. I'm not gonna lie. Maintenance in a native landscape is so different. It's its own little world, but it's mostly, as a designer, like digging up plants and putting them back where they're supposed to be, if I can, like if it's a small plant. I move a lot of salvias around. Another thing that I do is pruning. I'll do a lot of pruning. A lot of staking plants so that they're more upright. If anyone's grown a coneflower, they know they just have this tendency to be like horizontal. So I like to kind of prop them up with like a bamboo stick or something. A fair amount of weeding, but I don't fertilize. I replant things. So I'm going in going, okay, this spot is a little more bare. I'm going to put something in there. And then invasive species removal. There's plenty of invasive non-natives out there, so I'm constantly ripping those out. And then for frog fruit, so I have mowed the frog fruit plant, the most recent one I did, I mowed it twice in 1 year. So it doesn't need that much. The only thing is, what I learned, and I learned this the hard way, I lost a lot of plants because I put in smaller plants and then I added the frog fruit after. The frog fruit grew over those plants and I literally lost things. I was like digging, like ripping out frog fruit, trying to find like, where's that tiny little American fall sallow I planted 3 months ago? So unfortunately I messed up. But what I've learned from that experience is that you put the frog fruit in first and you let it just take over. And then you add in more mature sized plants that can grow out of that little canopy, because it is such a thick blanket that it will trap a lot of plants underneath it if you let it. That's my only warning about frog fruit.
Definitely still manageable. So you mentioned some invasive species control. What are some of the common invasive species that you see in your garden?
Okay, the bane of my existence is Bermuda grass, purple nutsedge, yellow nutsedge, elephant ear, and lately, like, I don't even know why, but Chinese tallow trees have been like following me because they weren't a problem before, and now I'm just seeing them in like random places. But luckily in a landscape, it's easier to maintain than in a prairie because they just take over prairies. Those are my top ones. The rest are just like random little broadleaf annuals like that happen in any garden. And sometimes native plants that I didn't plant will show up, and then I keep them because I'm like, oh, that's cool. But then sometimes ones that are not, okay, like we have this, we're pulling out a couple of plants at the park, and Alyssa, you know this, that are native, but they're undesirable because they'll take over. And they'll create like a monoculture if you're not careful. So there is a little bit of fine tuning that needs to be done in the maintenance world, but I think for the most part, it's just non-native invasives that I pull out.
Awesome, thank you. Okay, we got a few more questions in the chat. So what about, I'm gonna mispronounce this and I apologize in advance, lyrope or mondo grass as ground cover? Are you familiar with those?
Can you say those again?
It'll also be in the chat if you're able to view it. It's lyrope, L-I-R-I-O-P-E, lyrope. Thank you, Kelly. Or mondo grass.
Here is, okay, I'm sorry. I'm like having a moment. Mondo grass. Okay, so I've never heard of those. My biggest thing would be, are they native? If not, can you use a native instead? It's kind of like this like train of thought. I'm just from a quick Google search, I'm seeing that mondo grass is not native. And so I would say, okay, that beautiful turfy, that little round ball shape that it has, you can get that with Texas sedge, and Texas sedge is native. There's usually an equivalent to a non-native plant. For example, I advocate for replacing boxwoods with dwarf yaupon hollies or dwarf wax myrtles. There's usually a native alternative to something that's, yeah. So that would be for mondo grass at least. And then the other one, what did you say? I'm trying to pull up the chat, and I'm so sorry.
Oh, that's okay. You definitely got both of those. So, and there was also some feedback in the chat to include Cherokee sedge too. So thank y'all for your feedback.
Cherokee sedge is a little less round, and it won't grow like in that little mound, but it's a gorgeous plant for shade gardens. So if you have like an issue with shade, Cherokee sedge would be an amazing grass for that.
That's good to know. I didn't know that even. Okay, so what are some of the native plants that are so invasive that you kind of have to watch out for them in your home garden? I think you mentioned fringe-rush is one.
Goldenrod, Salvia coccinea. And okay, the salt marshmallow, not because it spreads, but because it's so large and it literally like shades out natives. So I don't pull it out, but I severely prune it. Like I have to constantly prune that one. It's still an amazing plant, and I really don't want to make it sound like it's not manageable. It is manageable, but just be conscious of how big it gets. Those are really the main ones that I'm dealing with in terms of natives. Yeah, other than that, I try and keep it, let things do what they want to do. If it looks good in the landscape and if it works with what I'm doing.
Nice. I like that perspective. Everything's there usually for a reason. So I think there was some feedback as well for like the ragweed and horseweed, as you mentioned, like depending on the landscape.
Yeah, I haven't run into those, but they're all along the bayou, you know, in larger fields and wildlife wilderness areas, you're going to encounter those. But, oh, I guess trumpet vine, it is native, but it's really hard to get rid of once it's there. And then poison ivy, I've started removing poison ivy, but I keep like, I want to say not a third, maybe like a sixth of the poison ivy in a site for the bees, because it is a good source for them during the winter, but I remove the rest of it, especially if it's in an area where people are going to be. But if it's like deep in the like understory of another shrub and no one's going to go back there. And you can also, I've seen people do this where they put signs that say, you know, poison ivy growing, don't touch, you know, and people respect signs usually. And if they don't, that's their fault, that's their problem. But poison ivy is a native plant, and I don't like to just eradicate it. It has its place, so yeah.
Awesome, I like that. Yeah, there's still some kind of value to it. Okay, so a few questions on passion vine. Ms. Petit mentioned that passion vine is starting to take over, and Ms. Taylor mentioned that it's actually in her yard, it's taking over a magnolia tree. She said it looks beautiful on the tree, but is it bad for the magnolia?
Well, passion flower is not evergreen, so there will be a point in time where it will die back. And I would say if you're enjoying the vine, let it be and make an assessment once it's dead, or once it, dies back. You can look at the tree and decide. But if you notice that the tree is in bad health, if you see a discoloration in the leaves, if you see wilting and anything abnormal, then you'll know that it's affecting the tree. But in my experience, I haven't really seen like vines like that, especially ones that are not like super invasive like kudzu and stuff. They usually don't harm the trees. But you have to kind of make that assessment yourself and determine, because you know the tree best, you've been there the longest, you've seen it. So you can know if it's doing anything unusual.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think it's you kind of have like 50-50 luck if you try and propagate it too, if you can pull some out. Usually, I think most passion vines, don't they kind of tend to take over an area if you let them. Have you seen that in your experience?
I keep them, I trellis them. I just keep them on the trellis, you know. If you have a structure where you're growing them on, it's easier to maintain because you can go, okay, anything that goes beyond this boundary, I can clip off. Like if you're just growing it along the fence, if it starts doing things outside the fence, that's where you draw the line and you cut it back. So I would just say, I mean, that's true for any vine, right? Like they do need to have some sort of structure. So as long as you give them that, it's easier for you to like decide how much you want to prune back and maintain.
Awesome. Do you know, is coral vine native or invasive?
Coral honeysuckle is native. It was featured in one of my slides, and it is a nectar source for hummingbirds. And I've seen like tons of bumblebees, and the Latin name is Lonicera sempervirens. And I've seen them sold at nurseries right now that are yellow. That's not the native one. You're going for this pink flower. But yes, coral honeysuckle vine is native.
Awesome, that's good. Okay, so it seems like we're getting a lot of like recommendations in the chat for those good low maintenance forbs. It seems like swamp sunflower, Turk's cap, again, they can spread, but are pretty low maintenance. Do you have any others that you would recommend that just kind of are your go-tos for low maintenance forbs?
Yeah, I wanted to make this presentation more plant heavy, but I moved away from that because I feel like Native Plant Society does such a good job at featuring plants, especially in the native landscape course. So anything that I tell you tonight is just a little scraping of like what you can do. What I've been working with recently is firewheel, latris, brown-eyed Susan. I'm actually going to start transitioning to do whirling butterfly, but not the cultivar. I want to start doing the native one, even though it gets crazy and towery. It's growing at Lauren's St. Julian's Crossing garden, and it looks so great. Another low maintenance one would be, I think it's hard to kill Texas coneflower. I transplanted some that were cuttings from like a field off of Highway 288, and I like destroyed the root system when I was pulling them out, and I just like plopped them in the ground and wished the best, and they're like doing amazing now. So I feel like that's an easy one. Rosinweed sunflower, Lanceleaf coreopsis, those are all going to be yellows. Echinacea sanguine, I want to encourage more people to grow that because I feel like we always grow purpurea, but sanguine is like our true native, and it's just beautiful. And if we can get more of those out there, we'll get more seeds in the bank. So definitely that one, and it's an easy one. Oh, heartleaf skullcap. I wanted to throw that one out there because a lot of people deal with full shade issues, and I have a full shade garden where I live currently, and the heartleaf skullcap has taken over, and it looks beautiful. So I highly recommend that as a shade plant. And I mean, I could go for days, y'all, about plants, so I don't want to. And all the people in this meeting, I'm sure, have like a wealth of knowledge, or at least some of you guys have a wealth of knowledge about plants that you could throw out there. I don't want to just list things off without, context, but those are the ones that I've used recently and I love, and I want to encourage.
Awesome. I think those are all good choices too. I guess we'll give it maybe another couple seconds in the chat, see if any other questions pop up. Know that there was a reminder in the chat, make sure there are still spaces available for landscaping for birds for our native landscape certification program this fall. So definitely, if this talk really piqued your interest, that's another way to kind of continue to learn more about these plants in the landscape. What was the name of the full class again, Philippa?
Scolata, it's like ovar. Heartleaf.
And it was heartleaf, right?
Yeah. Scolateria ovata.
Okay, awesome.
Scutellaria ovata. I swear, whoever, I don't know. Latin names have their place in this world, I'm telling y'all, but in a regular conversation, it's like it trips me up. I cannot pronounce these things. I'm always like, Scolatera. Fall aster. It's so for the bird landscaping class, that's going to be an amazing class. I'm going to take it. They're going to talk about making sure you provide a habitat and food source for your birds. If you want to make sure you're giving year-round habitat for insects, fall obedient plant, fall aster are like two plants that are like incredible fall bloomers. So the fall aster is the plant of the month, and it's on the slide, so I'm not going to pronounce that name because it's on there. It's yeah, something with SYMPH or something like that. But yeah, those are two good ones for fall. Now that we're transitioning into fall, it'd be a good time to plant those and get some blooms going.
Definitely. So I think that was our last question for the chat.